Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so very much for joining us today. If you're on the West Coast, it's still in the morning. If you're on the East Coast, it's the afternoon. And if you're anywhere around the globe, you're either early in the morning or in the evening. My name is Vera Zakem. I am a senior technology and policy advisor with the Institute for Security and Technology, where I lead efforts around technology, democracy, and disinformation. And this has been the area of my career for the past 18 or so years. I am so pleased to welcome you to this event on resilience, where I am going to be facilitating a conversation with some phenomenal and incredible experts around how do we actually strengthen resilience to combat disinformation and strengthen our democracy at home and abroad. So before we go into this topic, just to tell you a little bit more about the Institute for Security and Technology, and then of course I want to introduce our esteemed panelist. So Institute in Security and Technology is a West Coast nonprofit institute that is working to create very novel solutions to emerging security threats and emerging security challenges. And we do it via three ways. First, we conduct policy analysis, of course, and provide recommendations, but we also combine that by actually engaging with technology itself and thinking through technological tools to combat some of these challenges, as well as convening experts like we have here today from policy world, from the technology world, from civil society, and from the academia to really address and think about these problems, again, both at home and around the world. And our focus, of course, is very much on bias for action. So with that, I am beyond thrilled to introduce you the four phenomenal people we have here today to really think through and talk about different elements of how do we get at citizen and societal resilience to counter disinformation and actually strengthen our society from within. So first, I want to introduce Dr. Kristin Lord. She's the president and chief executive officer of IREX. IREX is an independent nonprofit organization dedicated to building a very inclusive world. It operates literally all over the world to combat some of the most unique challenges, including disinformation, education, literacy programs, and I'm sure Kristin will tell us more about it. Kristin has had an illustrious career. I won't go through all of it, but just to give you a few highlights, she was an acting president and executive vice president at the U.S. Institute for Peace. She was also an executive vice president and director of studies at the Center for New American Security. She has held leadership positions at George Washington University and was also with the undersecretary for the Democracy and Global Affairs at the State Department. Extraordinarily individual, widely published on the topics that we're going to be covering today. Next, I want to welcome Peter Singer, who also should not need much introduction. Strategist and senior fellow at New America Foundation, very widely published. And if you have not looked at some of his books, like War, I know I've closely read that one, and Burn In, strongly recommend that you check out his books. The next, I want to introduce Lauren Buitta, phenomenal individual. She's the CEO and founder of Girl Security. And this is an organization, a newer organization, but critical to our work, quite frankly, to building a more just world, both at home and around the world, particularly in empowering girls, young women, and marginalized community with actual learning and training and leadership development. And we'll talk about the gender lens in some of these issues as well. And finally, I want to welcome Olya Gurevich, who is the co-founder of an incredible technology company called Marvelous AI. It is an information security platform that combats disinformation and misinformation. She's also been a disinformation fellow at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University and has spent many years at the Technology Center. So with that, thank you all again for joining. I think we've received quite a response to this event. And I want to kind of start us off with, and this is a question to all of you, with a little bit of a framing. Right now, we have seen, certainly in America, and this is not just given 2020 election, we can talk about January 6th, the COVID pandemic of the last year, and certainly all over the world, way beyond we really were thinking about disinformation, misinformation in the American context. the way has disinformation has spread virally on social media, but also how it has impacted marginalized populations, how it has impacted communities all over the world. I know from my personal experience working this issue in the European context, I have also seen this firsthand, the impact of disinformation on targeted population, whether they're in rural parts or urban, different segments of society. And the key that always comes is, how do we actually strengthen resilience to countering disinformation and democracy? And there's a lot of things on the table, so I just want to open it up. Of course, there's media literacy and digital literacy, and making sure that folks have access to credible information, and even the internet and and then the tech tools. So I put that in the framing to really get your reaction and your response to what are some of these solutions. And if, Kristin, I'll start with you, and then we can kind of jump in and go down.
Great, thank you so much, Vera. And since I'm first, I'll thank you and the Institute for Security and Technology for hosting us and for this important debate today. I just want to start by saying, I think you're right to use the word resilience. We are not going to eradicate disinformation. We are not going to probably reduce it very much. It's about learning to live with it and mitigating its influences. And one of the points that I often make, and I know I'm not alone in this, Peter Singer has made this point before as well, and many others, is that so much of the conversation has focused on technology. How do we tweak the algorithms? How do we change the rules on the platforms? How do we deplatform individuals who are super spreaders? But so little of the conversation is about the people who consume information. But at the end of the day, when we live in democratic societies, when people do have a freedom of expression, when social platforms do have a business model that encourages connection and sharing of information, at the end of the day, something will always get through. Disinformation will always get through. And so what we really need to focus on is part of the equation, no silver bullet, but part of the equation is to really give individuals the tools they need to consume information more critically, and also recognize emotional manipulation. So it's not enough just to teach people to be good fact checkers, because we know that's not how our brains work. We engage with information emotionally as well as analytically. So it's helping people to recognize that. And just before I close, I'll say that this is not some fanciful idea out there. We have evidence that it works. We have rigorous data showing that it works. We have models in countries like Ukraine and Finland showing that this can be done. And so it's doable, but it's just dropped out of the conversation far too much. And I'd be happy to talk more later in the discussion about the specifics, but that's the big point I wanted to share to kick us off.
Fantastic. And Peter, over to you. Kristin made a very important point, how technology solutions are not the only ones. And you recently also wrote a piece in Time about digital literacy, as well as cyber hygiene or strengthening cyber education. So I'm curious, how do we actually balance that? If you can talk about broader resiliency, but also balancing with sort of countering disinformation through all of the tech tools and and all of the things that we're talking about in the social media context, but also really from your perspective, focusing on that digital literacy and cyber hygiene and cyber education. And to that, I know you've recently started at New America, a very interesting initiative to that, and as an example with the state of Florida. So I'm kind of curious if you can talk, kind of build on to what Kristin said and talk about resiliency in that context as well.
Sure. So, let me add in my thanks for hosting this important discussion. I'm a little fearful there's going to be everybody sort of nodding our head at, great idea, I totally agree, align with each other. But I think it's because we see consistencies and best practices. And the unfortunate truth is that for the most part, they're not being implemented. So if we think about the overall challenge of both misinformation and deliberate disinformation campaigns and kind of the broader issues of online toxicity, harassment, you name it, we have a problem. Unfortunately, we do not have a strategic approach to that problem. So, for example, in the United States, the Trump administration issued a cybersecurity strategy, which is a pretty good strategy, except it has 0 words about this entire problem set. It's completely focused on critical infrastructure protection. And now, we see the Biden administration starting to wrestle with, okay, we've got this whole other side of threat here. What do we do about it? And I think I'd carry through that cybersecurity parallel, in that you need a not just whole of government response, you need a whole of society response. There's, role for different government agencies, everything from your intelligence community to your Department of Education to state. But government's not enough. You need role by platform companies all the way down to the individual. And I just proffer, two particular things that we need to do a great deal more of, as opposed to the pure focus on the platforms themselves and their algorithms, which is important. I mean, I've been part of that debate, and deplatforming certain individuals. That's all important. But as Kristin rightly said, it is not enough. And I'd say two things. One is to have a better understanding of how mis and disinformation hits certain topic areas and clouds them, and stop, weirdly enough, treating a networked problem in isolation. So the pandemic is made much more difficult through disinformation campaigns, and we're maybe not even going to reach herd immunity because of that, because of the misinformation that surrounds vaccines. So you can't think about this is a public health issue versus this is a tech policy issue. Or climate change. About half of the climate change denialism that shapes real world beliefs is driven by bots. So how can you've got to understand that cross. So that's one level of action. And then the other is what you hit in terms of, and Kristin talked about, is not just reacting to the ecosystem, but preparing for it. And the digital literacy effort is key to this. We need to focus on the target, us, our kids, and better giving the skills to navigate this world. Other nations have it, they do it well. The United States, we don't. We've got, roughly 14,000 different school systems. A lot of them don't have digital literacy programs. Some of them do. Of the ones that do, not all of them are using the best vetted product. But more importantly, they don't have a great funding streams to them. The onus is on the teacher to find those toolkits. So literally, you've got teachers that are Googling for digital literacy tools to teach their kids with. And so in closing, what we've got launched at New America is a pretty exciting program. We're partnered with the Florida State Education System, where we're going to be creating a portal that will gather the different tools that are out there, catalog them. So I'm a teacher looking for tools appropriate for a 4th grade level. I'm a teacher looking for a 12th grade level. Bring them all together, make them usable. We just launched it. It's pretty exciting, but it's just Florida. That's not enough. And so, we're hopeful to build a national coalition around this effort.
And Pierre, thank you for that. And you're spot on, because just to your last point, this is such a humongous problem. And one of the biggest challenges, how do you actually scale to make sure that you actually have impact for these issues? So that's exactly it, because you just stated the statistics and the data. I want to go to Olya next and just really think about, again, kind of resilience, but also, you're coming from the technology world, and, ISD is also really bridges both the policy, civil society, as well as the technology side of the pie here. So I'm kind of curious, from your perspective, what you've seen in terms of narratives, and what do we do on the technology side to actually strengthen resiliency, and sort of your frame of thinking on this problem?
Sure. So first of all, thank you again for hosting this wonderful panel. And as a bit of background, my training is as a cognitive linguist. I didn't start out as a technologist. So what strikes me as really interesting about this is why it is that people are so susceptible to disinformation, what it is that makes us believe certain things. And at Marvelous, we've been focused on narratives over the last couple of years, which really goes beyond just truth or lies. We are trying to detect what kinds of themes feed into people's beliefs about the world. And I think I'll probably keep harping on narratives this entire panel. In terms of resilience, we've come to think of it in a couple ways. First, you've got to find ways to control the spread of bad information. And technology can be useful here from the bottom up. So one, technology can be helpful in studying the underlying narratives and incentive structures that lead to information operations. And this is where you have to really bring social sciences and technology together. Tech will never solve the problem by itself. For example, why was there this convergence between right-wing conspiracy theories about deep state like QAnon and the more left-leaning anti-vax movements? There's a sort of deeper psychological insight here somewhere. We're also interested in exposing these narratives and these incentives to the small organizations or individual people who are being attacked, as well as to the people who are being manipulated in this way. You can also use technology to be more proactive about what kinds of disinformation attacks are likely to come. They're not that hard to predict ahead of time. And second, or actually maybe first, you've got to fill the airways with positive and truthful information. As Peter said, it's a whole of society action. I like to think of it as sort of cognitive probiotics. These are truthful narratives that reinforce our values and that have to be rooted in local communities and diverse. Technology in this case can be used to track and measure the effectiveness of these positive narratives. And more broadly, as a whole of society, I think we need to start reconstructing long-running national narratives. Part of the reason we're so polarized is because we've sort of lost those, or maybe they were never sufficient to begin with. And the restoring trust in public institutions has to be key as part of education, but also part of all sorts of other efforts.
No, this is great. I mean, first of all, I think I want to commend you on the new term, which I may want to repeat, which I think is fabulous: cognitive probiotics. That's pretty awesome. Second, I couldn't also agree with you more. I think at the end of the day, when you talk about, part of the whole resilience conversation is restoring trust in institutions and restoring trust in our democracy, both at home and around the world. And it is for the democracy to deliver as a result. So again, into what you said and to what Peter said, the whole idea of why we really need this term that has been coined now within the community, this whole of society effort. But yeah, I think there's just no way one specific type of actor or sector can really have all the solutions. I want to, last but certainly not least, I want to turn to Lauren in this first part. And you have done some phenomenal work with girls' security. And I really, truly, for those of you who have not checked out Girls Security's website and Girls Security's work, please do. Because what Lauren and her team do, they actually literally train and empower girls and young women and provide them with some resiliency tools to address things like how do you actually see identify credible information, what's not information, and actually participate in foreign policy and national security. I know there's been a lot of work, and this is also a question to others as well, but I want to kick it off to Lauren first. There's been a lot of evidence and a lot of data around how women and girls and other marginalized communities as well have been really marginalized and disenfranchised, both here in the United States and around the world, due to disinformation. They've been it's disinformation that's led to online hate and harassment campaigns. And in some instances, this is what our fear as always is that disinformation and misinformation can lead to real world harm, whether we're talking about elections, where we're talking about COVID and making sure you're getting the right information about vaccine, or something completely different. So Lauren, I really would love to hear your perspective on resilience, particularly from your work working with young women.
Thanks, Vera, and thanks, IST. And I also love the probiotics. I think that's awesome. So Girls Security's approach to closing the gender gap in national security is a balance of learning with skills-based training. And I started in 2016. So one of the first programs we did was a national security patch for the Girl Scouts, and it focused on disinformation. And I don't think I understood at the time how kind of massive this topic would become, particularly for girls. But the basis of our model is this idea that girls exist in a society that often fails to secure them, and therefore they are highly resilient. They kind of develop this unsought security aptitude. And certainly in the digital domain, that's no exception. During our disinformation trainings, girls will mention how beauty advertising is considered disinformation by them. It primes them to accept false or misleading information that can have physical implications like eating disorders. And so from a really young age, girls kind of coexist in this digital domain where they're subject to what they perceive to be disinformation. They're also 3 times more likely to be cyberbullied. Recent studies have shown that they're more likely to be targeted by misinformation. So from our perspective, looking at a really long arc on girls and women's positioning in a democracy, if we don't tackle these issues with key interventions now, it has not just an impact on their personal security and their self-esteem, but it has this really long-term arc impact on their kind of position in the workforce. And then you throw in AI replacing like primarily women-dominated sectors, and that's a whole nother set of issues. But I think our approach to this, as we are national security practitioners that run girl security, but we also work really closely with adolescent mental health specialists. So everything that we do is equity and trauma informed, which is also really critical because in our mind, digital literacy is very different from defending against disinformation. You can talk about digital literacy without necessarily talking about disinformation, but from our perspective, we can't do that. And so it does require a lot of trauma informed work. And I think it's important to note just a couple of things that I'll share at the outset, and I'm happy to talk more about them, is, recognizing education and equity, and the importance of trusted messengers in local communities. We work across the country as well as some pilot programs in Morocco and the UK. And it's very important that there are trusted messengers who participate in this programming. To kind of Ola's point, the cognitive impact, we're looking at the brain science, which is not as robust for adults, but when you look at the adolescent kind of cognition and the impact on girls, the emotional part on their brain, it's quite significant. So there's all kinds of cascading impacts as a result of that. And then I think the last part, which has been quite challenging for us this year, especially after Capitol Hill, was the context in which we're having these conversations is so different. And young people, their environment is quite fragile. There's a lot of trauma, there's a lot of discord, there's a lot of osmosis from kind of watching the adults fight in very politically divisive ways. Mm-hmm. So I think training needs to be localized. And I think, as everyone would say, like, there's no one size fits all approach for every population. So making sure that programming can be specialized to support the needs of populations is really important.
I think you just hit something that's very important, and the need that to have not a general approach, but a very specific, targeted and tactical approach. I know within, when I think about, for example, new technology, and we talk about how context is really important, right? And so I think in this, and also when you deal with the resilience efforts and dealing with whether it's education campaigns, literacy programs, some of the cognitive issues that you're raising, how important it is that it's very targeted. So this relates to, Kristin, I want to turn back to you. And this is one question that I have, and I want to kind of now take us back from the US, but more to the global context as well. I know your work is very global, working around the world with partners and institutions. There's a lot of talk, and I know, and I can say this also from my own work that I've done globally on these issues. There's a lot of talk that, well, we need more media literacy. We need more digital literacy. We need more cyber education. We also need access, whether it's internet access to access to information. And okay, well, the US government and our partners and allies, we need to invest more in these efforts. But at the end of the day, how do we know? Is it that we need more of these efforts? Is it that we need more money and resourcing? Is it that we need more tools? So my question is, how do we know what to invest in within that? And if there's any kind of specifics that you can color to, and I'll open this question to others as well, because fundamentally, if we're going to invest resources, both as the US government and civil society and technology, how do we know what the impact that these efforts are having. So then we, of course, then, you know, the Biden administration can go to Congress to ask for more dollars. And now civil society can go to their funders and so on and so forth. So I'm very curious about the impact and a little bit more specifics into what is it that we should be investing in.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question, Vera. And there was a lot there, so I'll just touch on some of the
Yes,
high
sure.
points. I mean, we have really good evidence about what works. Could it be better? Absolutely. And for any funders out there, you know, please help us invest in testing interventions and refining them so we know better what works. But there is actually a lot of data out there about what works. And at IREX, you know, we do work on programs on media literacy in more than a dozen countries around the world, including the United States. And just us, and there are many other fine providers besides us, we working through peer learning networks. So informally, youth groups, mothers groups, and so on. We get very high results with that, up to 97% improvement in skills is demonstrated in a before-after test. We work on social media. So for instance, in countries like Indonesia, where you can reach millions on social media before key events like an election, RAND has recently done an RCT testing some of our messages in the United States, even with very polarized audiences, and seen an 8 to 17% decrease in liking of Kremlin memes. And that was with no tweaking whatsoever by us, just lifting existing content, not even targeting for a US audience. So imagine what could happen if we iterated. And then the last thing is working through school systems. We know this works. I've personally sat in classrooms in Ukraine, watched how social studies teachers integrate it right into their lesson, no additional course needed, no additional teachers needed. The Ministry of Education just is training their teachers to integrate this into the lesson plan. It's a very neat integration that's comes at a very, very low cost. So you asked about resources. Yes, it does take resources. It takes time, it takes some money. Honestly, though, compared to the scale of the problem, the resources needed are absolutely minuscule. What we really need is a strategy, to Peter's point. What we really need to do is think about scale, and we really need to be thinking about multiple vectors. We need to work through the existing institutions in our society that are already there, schools, libraries. We need to work through informal groups. Lauren mentioned the Girl Scouts, but there's so many others, AARP, you name it. You know, we need to connect media literacy messages to specific events, whether it's health events like the pandemic, whether it's about voting. And, you know, it just requires coordination effort. It's actually not that expensive, but we do need to invest. We need to invest in learning what works. We need to invest in programming, and we need to invest in sustainability and scale. And most importantly, we need a national and international strategy. I would love to see this featured at the Summit of Democracy that President Biden would like to hold. I think this is something that democracies around the world share. We can share we have a shared problem, and we can share solutions too.
No, I couldn't agree with you more. I think this is one of those challenges where there's an opportunity now, and there's a ripe opportunity, and the timing is right to really almost kind of think locally, act globally, and kind of marry and bridge those two together. Peter, I wanted to also turn to you on the same question, also just to kind of going from what Kristin said. What are your thoughts? Because now you are working actually in trying to implement some of these solutions at the state and local levels, and you've seen what needs to be done and what hasn't really worked, perhaps, not just in the United States, but around the world. Again, I'm kind of getting at, I always think about what is the impact that we're trying to achieve, and how do we scale that impact?
Well, I want to hit the first part, which is this incredible disconnect between what we talk about, what we fund, versus what works and what will be effective. And so let me put some numbers behind that. There was a study by the Carnegie Endowment. They gathered together 85 different reports written by 51 different organizations on what to do about the topic that we're gathered here today, what to do about mis and disinformation. And across all of those different experts' reports, the most frequently recommended action item was digital literacy. Now compare that most frequently recommended action item to everything from how much we debate and talk about, to the policy discussion, to what civil society and foundation grant making is steered towards. Look, I said it before, there's really, really important debates to be had about, the power of the platform companies and are they monopolies, and that's great. I'm part of those. But compare the energy, time, and money invested in that versus the most frequently recommended thing that we ought to do, and then hitting what Kristin just said, oh, by the way, it's not all that expensive. So we got a massive disconnect between what we need to do and what would be effective versus what we focus on. And I'd put a real point to those that are looking, who want to make a difference, and the grant makers and the like. Here's your chance. In terms of what specifically we can do, I love the approach that Kristin laid out. You sort of break it down into hitting a couple of areas that help the broader community as a whole. One is find out what works and invest in what works. And so across the different tools that are out there, there's many that are linked to the science of learning. They've got evidence behind them. That's what we need to support and or help others reach that kind of validation. The second part of it is to identify market gaps. What are useful tools that just aren't out there right now? We were literally just before this among our group talking about the popularity of graphic novellas among kids and used as education tools, and the rarity of them in this space. Video games is another. There's a really cool, for example, Dutch video game on disinformation, but most users, like US teachers, don't even know about it. So go after those market gaps. And then the third is everything you do, try and do it for scale. And so that's what we were after in this project that I mentioned in Florida, is that, rather than trying to invest in a single tool, we talked to, and this echoes what Lauren was saying, we talked to the user base, we talked to the teachers and said, what are your problems? And we are creating a portal for them to go to and find exactly what they need, tagged and matched to their needs. But scale, we're going to be able to roll this out for all of Florida K through 12 teachers. That's a big impact. But again, Florida is not the only state in the union. And that's one thing that I would add. There's sort of the parallels of there's a lot to learn from other nations, the Finlands and the like. The challenge is not just that we're not paying attention to what they're doing. We have a very different, system. They have a national education system. So we've got to work through our system. There's not a single one. And then another way of getting that is like matching grants and the like. And that echoes again what Lauren was saying. That allows you to have sort of national initiative, but roll it through trusted local actors.
I agree with you. And I think that the key piece, and I think, again, you mentioned this, I think Kristin and Lauren did, the trusted local actors, the local voices on the ground, whether it's in the US or around the world, how critical are they to actually building this resilience? I think it's really important because fundamentally, and we're talking about also trust in institutions, how fundamental it is to actually generating trust, right, with the information you consume. Just one more question, and I'm going to turn it to the audience because we're getting quite a few questions from the audience, which is fantastic. I want to turn it to both Olya and Lauren. And I want to talk a little bit, kind of piggybacking from what Peter just said, really about scale and tools. So when we think about these resilience efforts, what kind of technical tools, and we can think about, Olya, maybe you can comment on artificial intelligence, machine learning, and other tools that are out there, and then also non-technical tools, when you think about sort of how much we need to scale this issue, particularly around things like literacy, cyber education, access to credible information, and also including, and Lauren, I'm also curious for your perspective here, looking at other women and girls in other marginalized communities that are not based only on gender. So I'm curious, both of your perspective.
Sure, I can go first. One area where I think technology is particularly useful is in iterating and honing the content that can be used in these digital efforts, and also measuring the extent to which they are impactful. So if you're trying to change some long-running narrative, yes, you can use technology to measure how well your counter efforts are working. I'll start there.
Okay, no, that's great. Absolutely. I think the measuring piece, I think, is really critical here. Lauren, I'm curious your perspective on both technical and non-technical
Yeah, I mean,
solutions.
we try to use non-technical tools only because we want the programming to be as accessible. I guess I would just start by saying, identity is a huge part of the work that we do. We don't talk about this issue without talking about systemic racism and misogyny. Um, Girls have a high distrust of the platforms they use. Most of them are quite adept at information. They can identify a photoshopped image of Kendall Jenner, but if you show them a retweet by a fake account, that's when things get hairy. So I think there are ways to parse out the extent to which certain populations need certain types of specialized training. But I think it starts with a discourse around the social issues that we're confronting. I don't think we can separate one from the other. Because disinformation weaponizes racial and gender narratives, it's really important that that become a central part of the programming. I also think too, I wanted to just kind of hit the point home about the urgency of this, right? I mean, we have generations of adolescent girls right now who we find are normalizing a lot of behavior in their digital domain. For example, accepting explicit images from men, having explicit images shared about them. They're spending 10 to 12 hours on their cell phones on social media, even more in the pandemic. So I do think that we have to have this kind of holistic understanding of digital literacy plus all of these other issues that come with whether it's your racial identity or your gender identity. We actually are working on a graphic novel. We built a card game. We actually played the Dutch game, and I hope the creators aren't on it, but we found it was really hard. Girls in our program, I think over 300 girls played it, and it just wasn't designed for them. So I think to that point is having like culturally appropriate as well as gender appropriate, cool looking things that kids want to play is also really critical. And I think to the last point, which both Kristin and others noted, is teachers are competing with STEM learning. And while I love STEM, it has such a huge budget. And I think that there's such an opportunity to marry an investment with civics education, with digital literacy, and all these other issues that we're talking about to kind of redirect some of those resources and not create a competing demand for teachers, but to Kristin's point is to help them integrate it. And I think everyone is looking. We can't do enough in our space to provide schools and communities and girls with these tools. So I just wanted to hit the point home that I think there is a real sense of urgency to this issue.
And also on the sense of urgency, I worry hugely about what's happening this year with schools not even being open. I have school-age kids. They'll be okay, but so many others won't be.
And to your exact point, Olya, and to what you, Lauren, said, this is where we're also talking, this is also the earlier point I made about access and making sure that folks, that teachers and students have credible information, particularly we were talking earlier about this pandemic and how urgent this is, because as Kristin, as you noted, we are not out of the woods yet, by no stretch of the imagination in America. And think about what the global context, particularly in developing countries that do not have the resources that the United States do. And then, Lauren, to what you said, this is also an issue where not only that this has to come from the national level, but how much, and Peter, also to what you talked about the state of Florida and the need to scale, that really this needs to be worked into also state budgets and local initiatives as well. So I think to all of you, I think these are solid points. Let me turn over to audience questions, because we've actually gotten some really interesting one. And I'm actually going to start with Kristin, because I got a really specific one for you, and it's a fun one. So to kind of break up our discussion. So someone said, Dr. Lord, your excellent book on the information in politics was one of the first to appreciate the dark side of the information age. When you were writing it, did you ever anticipate just how bad it might become? I'm also curious if you adjust your argument based on what we have seen in the years since your book was published.
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate whoever asked this question. I do. Right around in the very early 2000s, 2000, 2001, around 2000, I was writing a book called Perils and Promise of Global Transparency: Why the Information Revolution May Not Lead to Democracy, Security, or Peace. And it was I'm sad to say it is the least read thing I've ever written. It is, it haunts me, that book, because I think so much of this was predictable. That said, I didn't predict some of the dynamics that are happening now. For instance, I mean, social media was around back when I wrote that book, but I did not envision extremist Buddhist monks in Myanmar virally spreading at light speed disinformation and hate speech about Rohingya that would lead to genocide. I mean, it was predictable if you read the chapter I wrote about Rwanda, but we didn't have quite those tools now. And so it's everything I wrote in the book times 100. And I so very wish I had been wrong. But I think one of the things to do is not to get overwhelmed by the problem and throw up our hands. There are things that we can do. We have evidence that there are interventions that work. And so one of my deep frustrations now is that we're just not getting on with it. Why are we not doing the things that we know work? And they're not even that hard. They just require a lot of people to focus and do it.
Just said how important is bias for action, and actually just now hunkering down and getting this done. And to your point, how this needs to be, again, addressed at the local, state, and national level, but even getting our friends and allies and partners to this conversation as well. And I know, Peter, you've written extensively on this as well, particularly in the age of social media and how the information age has changed this as well. So would love your comment on that. And then I'm actually going to ask you this question from the audience. This is an interesting one, and maybe you can comment in related to what Kristin just mentioned. What is the boundary between PSA campaigns to defend truth against dis and misinformation and government propaganda? And that's a really interesting one, I think. I'll just add a note to that, because when you look at some of a global authoritarian state actors like China, Iran, Russia, where also we're dealing with digital authoritarianism that are actually exporting state propaganda. So how do we actually deal with that and address those kind of actors and actions, and actually with this kind of digital literacy and resilience and PSA campaigns that we're also talking about in the information age that we're now living in?
So it's interesting because sometimes you'll hear a opposition made to digital literacy, or we call it cyber citizenship, and that actually links back to one of the other, how it relates to the broad, civics in terms of the skills that you need as a citizen in the 21st century is not just, knowing your US history, US Constitution. It's also, how do you navigate online? But you'll see this framing of it either as one, it's partisan, it's against me and my party. And that's sort of accelerated since the events of January 6th, which, again, look at what we're talking about here. The need for kids to and adults to have the skill to navigate effectively and safely online. It cuts across everything from vaccine misinformation to how girls are being treated to genocide. There's nothing inherently partisan about it. The second faux critique that's made is, this is censorship. This is just like Orwellian. No, that's actually kind of Orwellian in your attempt to gaslight it. So teaching someone the ability to, for example, recognize manipulated media or not, to recognize how they're being targeted online or not, teaching someone the skills to check from multiple different sources. That is actually the defense against authoritarian approaches and government propaganda. So don't you dare try and gaslight this by saying it's Orwellian, but yet that's one of the things that we see out there. Frankly, it's really frustrating both to see something that would, the need is going to go well past the D versus R debates of today. So it's not partisan, and it is certainly not censorship to provide people the skills on how to operate effectively online, as opposed to telling them what to think. Telling them what to think, that is Orwellian, that is censorship. Giving them the skills on how to approach this new space effectively, that's how you defend against that. So again, to put it in technical terms, it's often kind of a BS argument.
Solid points. And it's almost like, I think, to what you're saying, it's given that what Lauren said, what Olya said, with the urgency, this is the defense. And perhaps now we're at a point where we really need to go on the offense. on all of these sets of issues. Another question that came in, and this is for Olya. Olya, I want to come back to your idea of cognitive probiotics. The question is like, what and how do you actually scale cognitive probiotics?
We're still thinking about that, but if you think about what makes probiotics work, it's the 5 million strains of good bacteria that actually do something. So it is a conglomeration of very diverse strategies and voices. And if we're talking about racial justice or things like that, it's the positive positional narratives that have to come from local communities and to resonate within those local communities. I don't think you can build a single top-down narrative that will serve that purpose. It has to be a variety of things.
I think this is one area where I think there's going to be much further for exploration and some innovation around this as well. Another question, and for anyone who wants to take this on, and maybe Kristin and Lauren, if you can comment on this, is how do we address resistance to the various tools used to address disinformation? We're seeing opposition to various tools like fact checkers, and I think we've seen this also in the US and the global context, accusing them as being selective or also disseminating disinformation. How do we factor in skepticism and taking the action necessary to inoculate our population against disinformation, even in the education sphere? So curious, maybe start with Kristin and then Lauren, and if Peter, if you want to comment on that one as well, to talk about this.
Yeah, Vera, I think if we're honest, we have to say that there's always going to be some of this discussion. We just have to accept it. In societies that are fortunate enough to have free expression and people are allowed to express differences of opinion, this is going to be part of it. That said, I'll make a couple of comments. One is that I do think that by focusing on citizen consumers of information, we do help to take some of the pressure off. Right now, fact checkers and platforms, that is the only line of defense. And so, if anything that gets through, anything that's controversial there's no remedy. But to Peter's point, we can depoliticize this a bit by saying, look, we'll just give people the tools. We won't tell them what to believe or who to believe. We'll just tell them how to say what's fact, what's fiction, how do I analyze the credibility of this information. How do I recognize if I'm being emotionally manipulated, if someone seems to be pushing all my buttons for a reason or have an agenda? How do I deal with that? We know that works. I also want to get back to this issue of trust. All of this conversation about disinformation is happening in a social context. And right now, that context in the United States and many other countries is highly polarized and deeply marred by distrust. So, a very important parallel conversation we ought to be having is how to reduce polarization and also how to build social trust. I've personally been writing a lot about social trust lately, and also leadership and leaders who can be trusted and institutions that can be trusted, because, in an ideal world, dealing with the disinformation problem will help us build trust in institutions and leaders, and also trusted institutions and leaders will help us deal with the disinformation problem. So there's a virtuous cycle when it works well, and there's also a vicious cycle when there's distrust and disinformation. They feed each other, and we will never escape unless we attack all these different dimensions.
Absolutely. I think trust is really at the corner. If we don't trust the information we consume, the institutions and the leaders that deliver this information, we are in theory in a really bad place. Lauren, I want to turn to you, and in terms of this kind of distrust and skepticism about these tools and to counter, whether fact checkers or other tools, fact checking and other tools to counter disinformation, I would love to also get your perspective, not just on what you've seen through your work working with girls and young women, but also considering, you had mentioned earlier, which I think is super important, we are dealing with systemic racism in this country, and racism and other sides, anti-Semitism, other isms. These are real serious problems in the US and around the world. So when you take the cultural, the religious, the gender context, and in the work that you've done, have you seen skepticism to some of these tools and actually being receptive to even just countering disinformation and having access to credible information?
I mean, I think there's a couple of kind of layers to this. I mean, just to Kristin's point is, one of our honorary advisors, Sue Gordon, who was head of ODNI, one of the things that she said in one of our presentations, which we say a lot, is the truth has its own sound. And so we really try to emphasize through what we kind of call ethical decision making, trying to empower girls' resilience to parse information, even though we know that there may be limitations. But as all of us know, teenagers don't like being told what to do. So everything we do is question driven. We oftentimes say very little in our programming. And as I noted, they're quite adept and open to resources, as well as schools and community organizations. I think it's also just important to understand, at least from, first of all, I'm a white woman, but I'm speaking on behalf of an organization that serves, half of our population are African-American girls. And I think it's important to recognize there's an inherent distrust of security. If the messenger is a white male, that might be problematic. And so again, we need to be thinking about programming that is culturally appropriate, considers restorative justice frameworks, understands the narratives that underlie distrust and security. I think there's a lot of work that organizationally we're exploring, because it really is this unique moment in time where we have this confluence of racial injustice, aspects of the digital domain, this heightened political situation. And I think it's really just important to understand and recognize that this is a unique time that might require some new thinking, but certainly it requires bringing together a lot of the approaches like Olya mentioned about social sciences and so forth. So I think the first step is recognizing that we have to have these hard conversations if we want these types of programs to be effective. I think it really is important. I guess I'm hitting this point home, is that I think the equity and trauma-informed frameworks, as well as social and emotional learning, which is used in classrooms, can be applied and has such breadth that hasn't been explored. And then to the point that everyone is saying, trusted messengers at the community level that look like the populations that we're trying to reach. And I would also just say, I'd like to see more leadership at the government and industry level, because again, the point that we make is girls exist in a society that fails to secure them. And they exist right now in a space where they're targets for all kinds of different things. And once again, people are failing them. And so if we want to see more women in the cyber workforce, if we want to see more women in tech, more women in national security, these are not disparate issues. They are mutually interdependent. If we want to recruit and retain, then we need to show these girls that this is a field that they can go into that values their lived security experiences and their contribution. So I think we're talking about a much bigger workforce issue as well, in addition to kind of the immediate frontline issues.
No, without a question. And I think you can't separate in many ways. I know we're talking very specific some of the tactical specific issues, which I know folks that are really interested in knowing, but you can't separate it. You have to put this in a broader context. And I know your work, and I'm speaking from my experience also, how much it is really important to elevate these other voices, women and ethnicities, other ethnicities, and so on. This question, Peter, I know you touched on this, and Lauren is something, and Kristin, something both of you said. It's trust, but how do we start to address this when this disinformation and countering disinformation and misinformation, and really its impact on democracy, has become such a partisan issue? It has certainly become a polarized and partisan issue in the United States, and I would even argue it has also become, we have seen this kind of level of divisions in different parts of the world as well. So the specific question is, it seems that acknowledging the existence of disinformation is now being interpreted and dismissed by many as a liberal political effort. How do you convey to your target audience or a potentially hostile audience that countering disinformation isn't and can't be dismissed as a partisan project? So curious, Peter, I'll turn to you for your, because I know you had mentioned this earlier.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's sort of part of a larger, and one of the tactics in the space is gaslighting. You don't believe what you see, but I think the response to it is a little bit like how we've talked about it here, is that do not frame the misinformation and disinformation problem as solely a mis and disinformation problem. and also talk about how it links to so many other issues beyond just elections, democracy. It affects everything from public health. So do you care about how bad the pandemic has been? Well, experts, not just public health experts, but the bipartisan leaders of the Cyber Slaying Commission describe how the infodemic has made it worse. Okay, take it down a level. Do you care about your kids being able to find the right answers when they navigate online? So, I'll talk about everything. When I frame this issue, I'll talk about everything from, we've had election threats to the public health side to kids who are assigned to do a report on the pyramids, and how within a couple of hops on YouTube, they're suddenly exposed to, aliens built the pyramid, or it was this conspiracy theory. So maybe you don't care about politics. Maybe you don't care about public health. You care about your kids having that skill set to navigate that well. And then the other is the way that we talk about it. There's a back and forth within the field on digital literacy, and sometimes it's framed as partisan or not. We've chosen the term to use cyber citizenship, as it hits this broader notion. Again, it's nonpartisan, of what it takes to be a good citizen in the 21st century. Technology changes that, just as back in the 1800s, teaching people to read was part of being a good citizen, was helping you become a good citizen. Now it's doing that online. And it also, I think, kind of links back to this notion of what Lauren hit, is how it connects to, a discourse over civics and the like. So we've chosen that framing and found that it sort of sucks some of the poison out of the discourse. Well,
that's great. So we have only 4 minutes, so I want to hit it almost like a lightning round, this very last question. Here in that, we have on the global stage, the Biden administration has already pointed to that they're hoping to have the Summit of Democracy later in the year. Here at home, we are dealing with so many challenges, and we've talked a bit about them, everything from the economy to the pandemic, to racial and social injustice, to food insecurity, so many issues. So given all of this, both on a domestic front in terms of domestic policy and globally in terms of our US foreign policy, with this potential summit coming on, where does addressing disinformation and strengthening information integrity and strengthening resiliency measures to impact citizens, where does that rank? Should that be one of the top issues that should be addressed in our national conversation and our global conversation, given sort of the myriad of challenges that we're facing? So Kristin, I'll start with you, and then Lauren, Olya, and Peter.
All right, well, thanks again for hosting us today, Vera. What a great event. I'm trying not to be biased here because I work on this issue a lot, but I would put it up towards the top. And the reason I put it up towards the top is very similar to the point that Peter made earlier. It is so hard to delink this issue of misinformation and disinformation from almost any other problem that we work on. Are you talking about the pandemic? Okay, disinformation about whether to take the vaccine, disinformation about actions that protect you or don't protect you, has a direct impact on public health, and not just individuals' health, but public health. All of us suffer or benefit as a result. Okay, let's talk about environmental issues and climate change. Again, disinformation, major issue here. Politics, human rights activists, people being, regardless of what their positions are, people being discredited by the spread of false information about them, manipulated images, and so on. Okay, let's talk about issues of violence and even heritage issues. I mean, hundreds of people converged on Gettysburg this spring because there was some crazy conspiracy theory spread on social media that Antifa was going to rip down, desecrate a national Civil War battlefield. I mean, people think that their safety is on the line. The desecration of American symbols is on the line, and they can't tell if it's true or not unless they have the skills to ask those questions, and also to recognize when someone's intentionally trying to push their buttons to provoke an emotional response. And so helping people to step back, take a look, and also question their own behavior. Should I be sharing this information or should I not be sharing this information? That could have a big impact on almost everything else that we all work on.
Absolutely. So we have literally 1 minute. So others, if you can give me just like a quick kind of response.
I would just say, if you care about sustainability, democracy, equity, it's a moral imperative that we tackle this issue now.
Wonderful. Olya?
And to add to all of that, a democratic society operates on the cooperation of citizens. And if the citizens fundamentally don't believe anything that the government says, you've got a problem.
Great. Peter?
So about a month ago, as part of a session that brought together 30 top strategists and futurists from CIA, Fortune 500 companies and the like to predict the big problems and crises of the next 5 years in politics, economics, you name it, every single one of them in our projections was made worse by the problem of mis and disinformation. So it's not just about the past problems that we face right now. Whatever the next future crisis is, you got to handle the disinformation side of it too.
And I think you've hit the nail on the head, because this is not just, we're really thinking about the future here. This was a phenomenal conversation. I want to thank all of you from the Institute for Security and Technology for joining us, and for all of you watching. Please stay tuned. We're going to have many other events like this, bringing amazing experts from different communities together. And again, thank you all for joining. Take care.
Thank you.